Today on the Culture Architects Show, we are joined by Tim Spiker. Tim is a leadership advisor, founder of the consulting organization, the Apirio, and he's also the author of an interesting book that I recently read called The Only Leaders Worth Following: Why Some Leaders Succeed, Others Fail, and How the Quality of Our Lives Hangs in the Balance. The book is guided by the principle of who, not what, which Tim describes as kind of a data-driven, he calls it accidentally discovered, and we'll talk more about that, and rarely leveraged truth within leadership. We'll be updating this and other ideas from the book in a while, and it'll be interesting to see how Tim's work and research fit with the way that we talk about culture and leadership. So Tim, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thank you, David. Really excited to be here with you and to get a chance to visit with your audience.
Great. And my audience knows that, one of the things that I talk about all the time is I say that in my experience, the single most important ingredient in the success of any culture initiative, in my experience, is what I call CEO sponsorship. It starts at the top. You don't have a CEO that's saying this is important to us, we're not going to get very far. It doesn't get pushed up from below. And so I'm particularly interested that, the angle that you take on this, since you work so much on leadership and creating great leaders, you can't have great culture if you don't have great leaders. So we're going to dig deep into the leadership part. So let's start with the whole title of your book. Give us a little background, Tim, as to how did you come to the leadership space and write this book? Give us a little background.
Well, my entrance into the leadership space in general was maybe I've got multiple happy accidents in my life, but I had been, the best way to say it is I was duped. I was waiting tables, getting ready to start grad school, and one of my fellow servers invited me to an open house for a marketing company. And marketing was going to be something I wanted to dig into, and I was pretty sure there'd be a free meal involved, so I was there. Once I got there, however, though, I discovered about 5 minutes in that it was actually a recruiting meeting for a network marketing organization. And I was not interested in selling water purifiers to my family and friends. But I didn't want to make a scene, so I was going to wait for the break. And as I waited for the break, they started to talk about, what does it mean to be an employee? What does it mean to follow somebody? And it was such a negative room at that point. And I just checked out of the rest of the meeting. I didn't hear another word. It was kind of like Charlie Brown's teacher up there. And I just thought, why is it that way? And in that moment, the word that came to mind was leadership. And I walked out of that meeting that night saying, I'm going to go study whatever I can, talk to whomever I can. I want to learn more about leadership because it sounds like it could be way better than it is. So that's what launched me on the journey of working in this industry.
And so tell me about how you decided to write this book, or why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, the why is I couldn't not. Once I saw the data, once I saw the research, and I'm an engineer by education. I joke with people that the world is a safer place because I'm not a practicing engineer, and that's not actually a joke. That's true. But with that background, I love data. I love research. I love statistics. I love graphs. I love charts. I love all of it. And as I started working with a leadership consulting firm, we accidentally stumbled onto some data that pointed to something that it's kind of like one of those things that you can't unsee. And so for years I sat with it. It just sat inside of me, and you're kind of building a book, even though you're not yet writing it down or typing it up, and finally came to a spot where I couldn't hold off any longer. And so finally got it down into paper, started using it with our clients, which actually made it better and better because now we're really putting it into application, and we've got story after story from our clients. And then finally, I just had it as a PDF with my clients for 5 years. Wow. And everybody was like, Tim, come on. Can we please finally? And so finally I got across the finish line and actually got it into book form. So
nice. Yeah. And so you talk about this who, not what concept. And having read the book, I understand. But for our audience sake, describe the essence of this concept of the who and not the what, and where that comes from.
Yeah. So essentially, we were doing a series of assessments at my old consulting firm, bringing people up to the west side of Pikes Peak for a week at a time. And one of those assessments was a Leadership 360. It was one that we had built internally with the organization. And we were looking for connections between personality, natural ability, and leadership performance. And when we ran the statistical analysis, we found that there were no correlations at all, which surprised us.
Mm-hmm.
But at least then I could go back to our clients who would ask us, what's the magic mix? And we could just say there isn't one. There's not a magic mix. But in the midst of doing that research, my colleague Vanessa Kiley, in an act of desperation, just said to SPSS, please go find any correlation you can. And that statistical software came back and said, you're looking in the wrong places. There isn't a connection between personality and leadership performance. There isn't a connection between natural abilities and leadership performance. But if you'll just look within your own Leadership 360, you'll find that you're measuring 8 areas. 2 of them are driving 77% of the variability in this assessment, which means that 2 of them are more important than the other 6 combined. We had this data. I'll save us all 3 years because that's how long it took for the light bulb to come on for me. And after I share this, it might be a little embarrassing that it took 3 years, but it is what it is. But I was looking at my whiteboard one day and it just landed on me like a ton of bricks that those 2 areas that were responsible for 77% of the variability on that leadership assessment, they were different than the other 6. The other 6 were about what leaders do. Those 2 were about who leaders are. And that's when it just arrested me. I remember the moment when it happened and I was like, oh my goodness, who you are is 3/4 of leadership. And ever since that landed on me, I've been pursuing it to help people see it, to help people understand it, and to help leverage it.
And so clearly, it resonates. It makes sense. And as you point out in the book, and I'm sure in all of your talks, that it's, I'm going to say intuitively obvious, and I don't mean that in a negative kind of way, but it's intuitively obvious that when we think about the leaders that we want to follow, we usually think about the people that we say, I admire that man or woman. They're good people. Yeah. And yet there's always a debate about how much people can change. Are we who we are, or are there things we can change? And obviously you must have a perspective on that since you're teaching people to try to change. Tell me more about what can we change and what can't we change?
Yeah. Well, this is the number one question that we get, which is really interesting to me because we don't get pushback on what the data says. Yeah. I've never had anybody directly come at me and say, no, this is a load of garbage. It's not happened. Maybe someday it will, but it hasn't happened yet. But this question of how much can we change, especially as we get along later in life. And there are many things, including research, that point to the reality that we can grow and develop. So specifically, I will point to Cheryl Aumann and Theo Dawson's work, as they were leveraging off of Lawrence Kohlberg's work around the development of the inner core of who we are. And in their longitudinal study over 13 years, they measured people's ability to grow at the core of who they are in terms of their moral reasoning. And they found that no matter what age you are capable, statistically speaking, of growing and developing in those areas. Really interesting. They found that nobody reached the top levels of moral reasoning and development under the age of 35. So, and if you think about, okay, wait, maybe that means we need a little time in the saddle to really grow in the depth of who we are. I think the misunderstanding around can we change over time is really, it goes back to Piaget and the idea of formative years. His work has become so ubiquitous, we don't even cite it anymore. We just use the term formative years and we don't even say who came up with it because we just all accept it as gospel truth. And in where he did his research, it is gospel truth. It is accurate. The problem is he was measuring folks earlier in life. He didn't do a longitudinal study that took people into much later on in their life. And so the idea of formative years is so profound. We see it so much in ourselves. We see it so much in our kids that we come to this logical but erroneous conclusion that we can't grow and develop past the age of 30. Now, I will admit, and maybe something that we've all experienced, it is harder later in life. Sure. It is harder, and let's put that on the table. But something being hard is different than it being impossible.
Sure.
Well, and so,
and one of the things that I talk about often, Tim, as it relates to culture is I'm telling people that you should, for the most part, be trying to hire people who are going to be a good fit for the culture you're trying to build, because you're not likely to take many of the people who aren't a good fit and somehow magically change them.
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying, perhaps, and correct me if you're seeing this differently, maybe the way you would probably say this, I'm guessing, is yes, they can change, but it's going to be really hard for some of them. And I would say, to some extent, how much effort do I want to put into it? I'd be a lot better off finding people that are, generally speaking, already aligned around our culture.
Well, yeah,
what we have those people improve too.
Yeah. Well, what we would want in any of our organizations is to find the best and help them get better.
Right.
And as that pertains to alignment with our culture or leadership capabilities, that's what we would hope for. Can you take somebody that's running full speed in the opposite direction and turn them around to run full speed in the other direction? That's pretty difficult to do.
Right.
But the idea of how can we enhance? How can we help people get better? And the idea that doing that, especially at the highest levels of organization where you've got the most leverage and the most influence, hey, look, a 5 to 10% improvement in the quality of who you are as a human being is going to be multiplied by the scope and breadth of your influence. Yeah. And we see that throughout life everywhere. So we don't need to take a 180-degree turn with a leader in order to make a huge difference in an organization.
Makes sense. So let's go deeper on this, these two areas of who somebody is. And in your book, you talk about the aspects of being inwardly sound and outwardly focused. So let's break those two. Let's look at those individually. Let's start with inwardly sound. And just for our audience sake, give me a brief description of what does that really mean?
Probably the best way to describe inwardly sound is with an analogy. And I want you to think of a boat, a vessel that's headed out to sea. And I want you to think, how sound is that vessel? Can it take a beating from the wind and the waves? Is it seaworthy? Is it something you can count on? Does the structure of it have integrity such that you know that no matter what comes at it, it's going to be held together? Just take that same idea now and apply it to a person. Somebody who is so solid and grounded in who they are that no matter what gets thrown at them, they're not going to crack or break or end up in a ball in the corner. And even that, I say that people can go through seasons. Some of us have had moments where 10 years ago, I was a ball in the corner. But today I'm a more well-developed human being. And so I can take the punches today better than I could a decade ago. So the idea of being inwardly sound is at its very base level, this is somebody who I can count on in any circumstance. And those are the type of people that we tend to trust more because we know they're not going to be wrestling with their own demons while they're trying to lead us as much. And that gives us confidence in them as leaders.
Yeah. I think about that in the context of parenting and everything else that we do, that I think we bring to the world whoever we are with.
Yes.
Either we're inwardly sound, to use your phrase, or we're some variation of that. And people bring their own, whether you call them demons, shortcomings, insecurities.
Yes.
All of that they bring to whatever they do in their life, whether it's how they are as a parent, how they are as a teacher, how they are as a leader. You bring who you are, and the more solid you are, the better you're going to do in almost anything you're doing.
Yeah. You mentioned the word insecurity, David, and it is, my goodness. If I could eradicate one thing on planet Earth, that might be it. The disease of insecurity, the impact of insecurity, it's incalculable. The things that we do completely unconscious that we're doing them because of our insecurities. It is just such an incredible depressing force on the quality and efficiency. I mean, I've seen this in organizations where entire departments are being rallied not to execute the plan, but to assuage the insecurities of the leader of that department. And it is such a waste of time and energy, and it's so off from what the organization's up to. I've seen entire departments go in that direction. So insecurity is a big one. And look, let me say this. We all have insecurities. I'm not talking about, that we become Superman or Superwoman here and we never have a moment. if you look across the world, I think there are two kinds of people with insecurities and people with massive insecurities. I think we want to just do our level best to stay out of the massive insecurities space. It's not as if we'll be perfectly confident at all times, but how do we not let our insecurities drive the car in our lives is a really important part of leadership.
Yeah. And I think what you just said there is really critical, Tim, that, not letting it drive the car. So we all have our shortcomings, but do we allow those to drive our decision making? We talk about one of the fundamentals we talk about in many of our clients. It's one of our own. We call it check the ego at the door. And I often say when teaching that, it's not that we don't have any ego. We all do. It's that we don't let ego drive our decision making. We make decisions for what's good for the organization, not what will serve my ego.
Yeah,
and I think
absolutely.
you're saying the same thing there. It's, we're going to have insecurities or whatever, but we're not letting our insecurities drive the decision making. What drives the decision making is what's best for the team. What's going to help this organization or department or whatever to be more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
So we've got these two aspects. We've got the being inwardly sound and talk about the outwardly focused.
So you've set us up a little bit for a really great teaching with that terminology. And it's something that happens quite often. So I want to shift your language just a little bit from outwardly focused to others focused.
Others focused. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
and you had a good point about that in the book.
Well, and that's what I'm saying.
Distinction. Yes.
You've set us up well here. I had a friend, Steve Wilson, as I was writing the book, he said, you should really change it to outwardly focused. And I totally get it because it's a nice yin yang, right? Inwardly sound, outwardly focused. It makes sense, except for it creates an opening for us to misunderstand what it means. Years after this research came out, I had a chance to read an article by somebody who was citing the research. And as I read the article, I got depressed, honestly, because it took the whole idea in a totally different direction. It used this idea, it changed others' focus to be outwardly focused. And it was essentially an article about marketing and listening to your clients. Now, there's no question that we should all listen to our clients in a business environment. Of course, that's good, sound principle, voice of the customer, all of that we should actually do. But within that article, what you saw, what totally got eliminated was the personal relationships with people and the idea of being focused on them. It was kind of, how do I get information from them in order to make our company better? But it wasn't about leading anybody. It was also kind of a bastardization of the word leadership as well on top of that. But I share that story to say we're much more challenged to be others focused than we are by the term being outwardly focused. We could spend $100 million on a marketing campaign to be outwardly focused, but that doesn't mean that I'm knee to knee with other people, caring about them in the midst of their development and their lives. And that's really what being others focused is about. It's about digging in knee to knee, eyeball to eyeball with other people and seeing them for who they are and caring for them as leaders. And so that was a good, whether you maybe didn't mean to do it, but that was a good setup, David, because others focus really is about others.
Yeah. So there was, as you broke down in the book, that there's a section where for each of those two, being others focused and being inwardly sound, you described some of the attributes, behaviors that are elements of each of those. And then you have one that crosses in both of them.
Yes.
Talk more about that.
Yeah. Emotional maturity is the one that has a foot in both of those worlds, because emotional maturity has to deal with not only how we're recognizing and engaging with others' emotions, but maybe even first as a foundational, how we're recognizing and engaging with our own emotions. And so that emotional governor, if you will. And so many times when we think about emotional maturity, we think about, not blowing up in tense situations and things like that. And look, that's fair. People have done the whole career limiting move piece because they didn't manage themselves in moments. But I find interesting a lot of other stories about having emotion where it needs to be present and should be present. I think of a story about a leader that I was close to and knew about, and decided in the midst of turmoil that his move very naturally was going to be essentially stoicism, which at a certain level, I think his goal was to provide stability in the midst of challenge. The problem is he was the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz. He was so non-emotive and non-acknowledging and just kind of carrying on. It's just imagine the whole thing falling down and somebody standing in the middle of it saying, I don't see anything. That's essentially what we felt as followers in that season.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would call lack of emotional maturity on his part disconnected him from us. What we needed from him was more emotion. Not that he needed to be screaming and yelling, but we needed to see that he understood that this was hard, that challenging things were going on. So emotional maturity is not just about how we see, understand, and engage with the emotions of others, but it has a lot to do with how we are engaging with our own emotions as well.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, I liked when you described, and it's something I learned years ago, kind of this, I'll describe it as a separation between feeling the emotion and acting upon it. There was something I learned many years ago from a man named Lloyd Fickett, who taught a series of communication tools called the collaborative way that have become very foundational to a lot of our work. And I remember Lloyd talking about the difference between an event and our interpretation of the event. In other words, something happens and then we apply an interpretation to it. And when we collapse the two as if they're one, we lose flexibility. And when we can open up some space between those two and say, okay, an event happened. That's true. That's a fact. And I can open up some space and I can decide how I want to interpret that. And I had the same feeling as I was reading your description of sort of this opening of space between feeling the emotion and now what am I going to do about that? So talk more about that.
Yeah, boy, I so appreciate that, because how do we become conscious of this? And I think back to my earlier days, and I think I so wish that somebody had introduced to me the idea that you just said. Tim, do you know that there's space between what happened and your interpretation of what happened? Because most of us, when we are in our least mature state, this is what happened. Like, you don't even hear your interpretation. The person who I have to thank the most for this is Dr. Mary Shippey. Dr. Shippey and I worked at the same consulting firm, and she saw me doing this day in and day out. And she was gracious enough to offer some coaching to me. And one day she took me out to the stream behind the office building where we were there in Cherry Creek in downtown Denver. And she said, Tim, I'm going to do something and I want you to tell me what happened. And she walked out into the stream. I was sitting there on the bank and she marched up to me with all kinds of kind of aggressive motion, kind of in a huff. And then she said to me, kind of like she did like that, okay, and scene, like she ended it. And she said, okay, Tim, tell me what you saw. David, I had volumes, I had paragraphs, I had pages, I had all this interpretation of what was going on with this character that she had just played. And she let me go on and on. I didn't know it, but I was burying myself with every word. She let me go on and on. Finally, when I ran out of stories that I was writing, she said to me, no, Tim, I walked up to you aggressively in the stream. That's it.
Yeah.
And I was stunned.
Yeah.
And I'm so thankful to Dr. Shippey. Not that I get it right all the time today.
But everything else is a story.
Everything else is an interpretation. And look, in emotional maturity, we're not asking people to not have an interpretation. We're asking you to be conscious that it's going on, asking you to be aware, and asking you perhaps to be also open to the fact that your initial interpretation may or may not, probably isn't the whole story, frankly.
Yes.
And so I'm so thankful to Dr. Shippey. I'm sure my kids would tell you that I've got a world still to grow and develop, but they have no idea how bad it would be if Dr. Shippey hadn't helped me learn that so many years ago.
Yeah. There was a fundamental in our first company that the language I used to use, I called it, the title was "Be quick to ask and slow to judge." And it's just learning to just take a deep breath and say, hang on, there's probably a lot more going on here that I don't know about. Let me ask some questions here before I find out anything further.
That's a great phrase. Anybody listening, if you feel like you
to ask and slow to judge.
Homemade bumper stickers, put that one somewhere where you can see it. Yes. Wonderful.
There was another thing that I learned back then, again, from this person, Lloyd Fickett, who was very influential. And he talked about, from a listening perspective, the phrase he used to use is that we all have filters for our listening. That as I'm listening, I have a filter that I believe this person, I don't believe. They're a good person, they're a bad person. They're smart, they're not.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
whatever. And much as you're saying about emotion, Lloyd would say, it's not that it's not possible to not have filters. The key is just recognizing what filter is going on right now. As I'm listening through this filter of X, Y, or Z. And if I recognize that, I at least have more power to say, oh, there could be another way of listening through this or interpreting this, and be open to the possibility that there are other ways of looking at this situation.
Well, and I'll go back to Dr. Shippey again. In the midst of that coaching with me, not just that day, but over a number of months, one of the phrases that she introduced to me is very simple, and probably many people have heard it, but tell me more about that.
Yes.
It's been it's one of the top 5 most powerful phrases in my life. Yes. Tell me more about that. And I am stunned at what I learn when I simply say to somebody, tell me more about it. And the number of times where I am 100% already accurate on, it's almost zero. It's almost zero. There's always some edge. I had a really profound interaction with this just over the weekend with my oldest son. Back to the parenting examples. Not that the people that are working for us are kids, but these are good. I mean, this is a space of leadership as well. Yeah. I was explaining to him, we're getting ready to move to a new home, and we're doing all the normal kind of cleanup and little repair stuff that's going on. And we had a grate over an intake on the AC unit that looked like it had not been cleaned since World War I. And I said, let's get after that. And so he was cleaning it off, and I felt like we could do a better job. And one of the biggest things I'm trying to teach my kids these days is, what does it mean to do a good job? Mm-hmm. And so I am wanting to help him see what a good job is, but in a moment of lucidity, thankfully, I asked him a few questions. I don't normally do this, so he could attest to this, but this time I did. Okay, here's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to talk about what does it mean to do a good job, and there was enough space for him to speak into it. And what he said was, look, I don't think this matters. I don't think that cleaning this grate matters. And just by creating just a bare amount of space, all of a sudden I realized that I'm trying to lead him towards learning about what a good job. Look, if he looks at the project and said, this project doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if this grate is clean or not. All of a sudden I'm like, well, on one hand, as a parent, I'm like, well, now I'm stuck. What do I do now? But just, again, I don't always do this well, especially in parenting, but it was a moment where there was some space just for a little bit of curiosity. Yes. And all of a sudden I realized I couldn't, in the way that I was attempting to lead him, I wasn't going to be successful, because he's saying, look, this doesn't matter. It's not about a good job or a bad job. You're asking me to move sand up one hill to another. It doesn't matter. And all of a sudden, it made me maybe not a good leader, but maybe I wasn't as bad as I was before that, because there was space to learn something. Tell me more about that. So little examples to show up all the time.
And you saw what he was doing from a different context.
Yeah. Completely. All of a sudden it wasn't he's lazy or he doesn't get it, or it wasn't those things. It was, okay, he and I have a disagreement about whether or not this matters. And therefore it's going to be, how do I teach him the thing that's way more important to me, which is how do we learn to do a good job? How do we learn to work hard? I just realized I'm going to have to take a different angle on this one, because he doesn't see it the same way. Otherwise, I would have just done what I do too often, which just, beat that drum louder and harder and just come after it.
I mean, he doesn't listen better when you say it louder?
Well, no, he doesn't. But it would have been used. And here's another thing to think about in the scheme of leadership. When I don't pause to hear and to understand that he's actually looking at the whole project differently than I am, now I do beat the drum louder and harder. What does it do to the relationship when I'm doing that? I don't realize that he's seen a totally different story than I am, but all he knows is, here comes dad with the loud drum all the time. And now I've actually gone backwards as a leader, because I've damaged the relationship. And so I know it's too often that I do that. I happen to come up with one moment where one out of 15 moments where I didn't, but it was, it's an example of, hey, how can we use curiosity in our leadership?
Yeah. So I want to just touch on an interesting question about this emotional maturity. So a big part of that you write about, and I often see written about, is empathy, the ability to feel what other people feel. And I'm curious, it's just something that I've been thinking about because it's an area that I lack, as my wife would attest to. And anyone that works with me knows empathy is not strong in my skill set. But I think there's a difference, and I'm just the language that I use for this, and it's just my own, is I think about the difference between what I would call, again, I'm going to use this phrase, emotional intelligence and empathy. And the distinction that I would draw, and I'm just curious about your response to this, is I would say that empathy is the ability to feel what other people are feeling, where emotional intelligence is the ability to understand what they might be feeling and respond appropriately, to be appropriately sensitive to what others might be feeling, even if you can't feel it yourself. And so I would say that I lack significant abilities to have empathy. I don't feel what others feel, but I'm sensitive enough and aware enough to say, I can imagine how that person might be feeling, and therefore be sensitive and aware of that. How would you respond to that?
Well, let me ask you a question.
Take on that.
Let me ask you a question. If you could wave a magic wand or push a button and become more empathic, would you?
Probably not.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's necessary.
Okay.
And so to feel the pain that somebody else is feeling, in my own mind, I'm not sure that that has a tremendous amount of value unless I was clueless about what they're experiencing. Okay. So if I can at least understand that and respond appropriately and not be clueless about it, now I've got something that's useful. But simply feeling their pain, maybe it's because I'm such a utilitarian, I'm not sure that that's as useful to me. So I'm not sure I would want to be.
Well, I think, and I'm going to do one of those classic both and answers here. Sure. I think ultimately what you want is both in an ideal world. And it's part of the reason why we picked the terminology emotional maturity, because we know Daniel Goleman's great work and well-known emotional intelligence and all the things that are out there regarding that. But we wanted to go a next step into the action space. And we felt like if we could say, hey, the whole of what we're after here is more than just understanding emotions, which in and of itself is valuable. But can we entice and bring people towards also that space, as you put it, with empathy in feeling things? And what does that do? I do think that it's certainly better to be emotionally intelligent and to understand how emotions are showing up and what they're doing than to not be. I would contend, as I've watched with our clients, is the people who are able to have empathy alongside emotional intelligence, in other words, what we would call emotional maturity, that they have a leg up, because then they're feeling with somebody, but it's not a blind feeling. You probably know some people that are super naturally empathic. It's almost like their mirror neurons are more developed than the rest of ours, and they're just with people in the moment, but there isn't a lot of thoughtfulness necessarily about what's going on. They're just kind of sucked in. And so I could easily argue that being sucked in emotionally without a greater understanding of the emotional space that's going on, I could see where that's not as valuable as it could be as well. Yes, I'm with you, but do I understand the greater context? So I would contend that an emotional maturity hopefully encompasses both of those things, where we can kind of get the best of both worlds. Because I find that when we do the hard work, and by the way, empathy, tough place for me as well. I mentioned earlier, engineer. So there we go. What I find is that when I pause to actually feel, and when I pause to try to do that work, not just the understanding part, that my natural tone, my wording, everything about me shifts when I go from understanding to also feeling. And then, interestingly enough, if I'm in that space emotionally with them, I end up having to be a little bit less, almost a little less guarded, a little less, how do I pick my words perfectly? Because my connection with them emotionally is driving some of that tone, driving some of that language. And so in that space, what I hope for essentially is both. The emotional intelligence part that has the understanding. I'll share one other exercise, perhaps this would be valuable to the folks that are listening. We call it the 300-second pause. And so, if you're doing the math, yes, that's 5 minutes, but 300 seconds is more fun to say. And what we talk about that we get a lot of positive feedback around in this space is if I look at my week and I've got 2 or 3 meetings during the week where I think, oh, that could be a charged one. There's some challenging relationships there. Or there's somebody that I have trouble with. And just to take a literal 300-second amount of time, which is actually a pretty decent amount of time when you pause and think about it.
It is.
And the exercise is to do this. What's it going to be like? What could it be like to be on the other side of me in this meeting? What is that other person who I really don't like, if I'm being honest? What are they bringing into the meeting? What are the challenges? What are the edicts? What are the things that they need to walk out of this meeting with? What are they hoping for? What's the history, not only with this subject, but with me? And what would it feel like? What might they be feeling as they step into this different? Usually I'm just thinking about what am I feeling about this different. And what we find is when people will take on, we ask them to do it a couple times a week when we're in our unit working on empathy. What we find is that it fundamentally shifts the interaction to become more productive for all parties when I take the time to not only intellectually think about the emotions, but to actually feel. And if people get hung up sometimes, they'll be like, well, I didn't have that exact experience that they've had. Yes, okay, agreed. But have you ever felt frustrated? Can you think of a time in your life when you've been really frustrated? Well, yes, I've had that experience. Okay, then great. If you think that's what they might be feeling, then just think back to the time. It's almost like method acting. Think back to the time when you were supremely frustrated. Now, let's interact with that understanding. Oh, yeah, I remember that feeling. That sucked. That was terrible. And all of a sudden now, we open the door to more connection that's more productive for everybody. So that 300-second pause idea is to help us bridge the gap from emotional intelligence to be connected also to this idea of feeling those feelings. But it's hard. I mean, there's no sugarcoating that. That's really tough for some of us. It sounds like you and me. It's a tougher ask than it is for some other people. But I do see value in it. I think it enhances the emotional understanding.
Makes sense. You know, we teach in our system a set of behaviors that we teach people to be practicing that we call fundamentals. And a very common theme, I was working with a number of clients recently in this area, and there's a very common theme that crosses many different fundamentals. And the common theme is learning to think from somebody else's perspective. And it's really what you're talking about in so much of this. And it seems to me so much of empathy, of emotional intelligence, of just being effective is the ability to get out of your own brain and like stop, get out of your head and think from somebody else's perspective. And okay, if I were that person, which is what you're describing even in a meeting, but in all circumstances, imagine how this would come across. How would this sound? How would this feel? What would this look like if you were in somebody else's shoes? And there are probably 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different fundamentals that all have as a common theme or an underpinning some aspect of being able to think from somebody else's perspective. And it's remarkable how few people do that very well.
It's just hard, though. I mean, to your point, we have to get out of our own way. We have to not be the center of the show. One of the things as we talk about with empathy with our clients is empathy. If I'm going to show up empathically, I am intuitively and fundamentally saying I'm not the only one that matters. And I just think that as human beings, we have a bent towards ourselves. And so empathy for many of us is an exercise of going against the grain and really acknowledging, I mean, I don't want to feel any more negative emotion than I have to. And yet so many times that's what empathy invites. It can invite us to experience positive emotion as well. But so many times it's about negative. So it's just tough work to go against the grain of self-centeredness and self-interest to be empathic with, especially with emotions that aren't fun to feel.
Yeah. As Rolando and I were talking last week about your book, we had an interesting contrasting response to a part of it. And you were describing in the book, I think it was basically the impact of leaders who aren't the kind of people you want to follow. Leaders who are not inwardly sound and others focused. and the kind of dysfunction you described at the beginning of our exchange. You described some of what that looks like when you're working in an environment and the dysfunction that goes with working in that kind of environment with, I would call them dysfunctional leaders, but, and we see them a lot. And what was interesting about Rolando and my differing responses to that part of your book was that for Rolando, it kicked up a lot of emotion for him, remembering times he's been in those experiences and what that felt like and how painful it was and how difficult it was. And I suppose for many people it does that. And for me, I have the good fortune at some level of I've only worked for myself. I've only had my own companies. And so I've never worked in one of these dysfunctional places. And so it's like, do people really act like that? I can't fathom that. And yet I know intellectually because I talk to people where there is an incredible amount of dysfunction in companies. I've just never lived in that the way so many people have. But it's just, I look at that, I hear people talk about bosses they've had who used to yell at them or throw things. That's just like, that's a complete non-compute to me. I can't even fathom that happening. And yet I'm sure many of our listeners have worked in places or maybe are currently working in places where that kind of stuff goes on.
Well, I mean, we can tell more bad stories. You know, I'm thinking particularly of a senior executive in a not quite, well, now it's $1 billion organization. So lest we think that dysfunctional, unhealthy leaders don't make their way into very high levels of very large companies. They do. But in this particular story, I'm thinking of, you've got a department head in an executive meeting who brought somebody who reported to that person into the meeting, update on a project that they were working on. And the two of them had a little miscommunication about a minor part of the project, not a big deal. And this is not an organization that strings people up for small little things like that. It wasn't a big deal, but they had one person thought the answer was A, the other person was B, and is like, you know what, we'll get together afterwards and we'll hash that out. Immediately after that, the person reporting to the executive ended up in that executive's office. And the executive said very point blank, now I've got to start protecting myself. Oh, and you too. I'm like, and the person was like, well, what are you talking about? And went on to talk about what an enormous issue that was in the executive meeting, that they'd had that minor detail. And in the end, that story is 100% back to the issue of insecurity. That senior executive wasn't sure that he deserved to be in the room. And so any perceived miscommunication or disagreement was going to call into question his very existence in the room. So much so that he's now consciously saying, I'm going to start protecting myself. And he did. And I will tell you, not long after that, the person who reported to him, who was considered a future potential president of that company, left. Because like I'm done with this, because this level of unhealth. And even if you look at the president and other people and say, well, the president wasn't involved, the other executives aren't. It's like, no, but they believed that this person should be on the executive team. They fostered that. They kept the person there.
Absolutely.
And that person said, this is not an environment I want to invest myself long term, because this is how this place works. So I'm going to roll. And he did. So there's
That's amazing.
I mean, to say it out loud is the thing that kind of blows me away. Like people will think things like that, but it's not very often they call somebody in their office and say, now I've got to start protecting myself. And
I'm that short-sighted that nothing else matters but me.
Well, and caught himself in the moment and said, oh, wait, and you. And it was funny is the person reporting to him was like, what do we need protecting from? What are you talking about? Like, I don't need any protection. That was a moment in the meeting. It's not even a big deal, but that's how dysfunctional and unhealthy that leader was. And so, these stories.
I'm one of the questions that I am often asked is about, when I look at all the many, we've worked with over 1,000 companies, and so I've seen a lot of leaders, as have you. And I'm often asked from a culture standpoint, what's the difference between those companies that are really successful at the work that we do with them and those that are less successful? And one of the things that I have said often, and just my observation, is that better leaders implement everything they do better than people who aren't as good leaders.
Yeah.
And that whether they're implementing what I teach, or they're implementing lean improvements, or they're implementing something else, whatever they do, they implement them better because they're just better leaders. They do the things that you wrote about and you talk about. And I would add to that just this is simply my observation, not research-based, but just from what I've seen, that in my mind, there's a difference between what I would call a good business person and what I would call a good leader. And they sometimes exist in the same human, and sometimes they don't. Mm-hmm. And in the way that I'm using that language, I would describe a good business person as somebody who perhaps makes good strategic decisions about where to invest our resources, or what, product or market we should be in, or those kinds of things. And someone might be very smart about those, but that's a very different skill set than being a good leader of human beings, as you've described in your book.
Yeah.
And, ideally, the best CEOs or leaders have both.
Right.
But those are two different things, and they're not always in the same person. If I think of the thousands we've worked with a whole lot of companies, and they all have CEOs, I would say, without exception, who care and want to do the right thing. But some of them just aren't very good leaders, and some are, and they lack many of the things that you're describing.
Yeah. Well, I first of all, I totally agree with you. And I think we just have to understand that I can never strategize myself into being inwardly sound and others focused.
Yeah.
I can never solve a who problem with a what solution. And in the end, as we talk about leadership, there's just a very fundamental question: is who do I want to follow? Sometimes when I think about this type of question, this type of idea, I put the zombie apocalypse test to it, which is to say the zombie apocalypse is going on, and this person who's in question knocks at my door and says, "Follow me. I will take you and your family to safety." At that point, who am I willing to put my full trust in, my life and death trust in? And why are they trying to help? I mean, there are some great strategists when they knock on your door and say, help. There are some of us who've had the experience of like, yeah, but what's your angle? Like, why are you asking for my help? I'm a little suspicious here. I mean, it sounds good, but tell me more, because I think maybe you're using me for something. Like, what's the whole story here? Whereas when that leader who is for me, who is sound in who they are, when they knock on the door, and I'm thinking somebody very specific in my own life, a gentleman named Mike Kane, if he came knocking on my door at the zombie apocalypse and said, come this way, I'd be like, let's go, everybody. Like, just leave it all. We're going, because I know that Mike isn't asking me to do something solely for his own benefit, his own promotion, his own survival, his own anything. He always had other people in mind. And so, yes, being a smart business person and being a great leader are two very different things. Hopefully they show up in the same person. But as you're interacting with folks, and as I do as well, I do think it's important to say to somebody, what's your bigger goal? If your bigger goal is to be a smart business person, then okay, let's not call that leadership. Let's call that you want to be a really smart business person.
Yeah.
But what's your higher priority? Being a really smart business person or being a leader? They're not antithetical. But understanding what your higher priority is probably pretty important as you think about your own development.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating, Tim. So if our audience members would like to learn more about your book, your work, the work that your company does, tell me, where do they find you?
Thanks. Well, the book is on Amazon because, well, it's Amazon. So
everything's on Amazon.
Yeah. So The Only Leaders Worth Following is the title of the book. And then if they want to find out a little bit more about our work or our company, the easiest place to find us is beworthfollowing.com.
Great. Well, Tim, I really appreciate your wisdom and your willingness to share that with me and with our audience. I think it's really valuable, and it goes to the heart of, you can't build a great culture without a great leader.
True.
And it starts with leadership. And so your contributions to helping develop better leaders flows directly to creating better culture. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.